sometimes you're given some reasoning and you're told that it's valid, and then your job is just to prove that it's valid by constructing a derivation from the premises to the conclusion within our proof system. But what happens when you're not told up front whether the argument is valid or not, and you need to figure that out? What do you do? How do you do that? These are some arguments taken from Chapter 36 exercises of the textbook. Let's go through them one by one, and we'll talk about how to figure out whether the reasoning is valid or not. Okay, so we'll start with this example here. We've got our two premises and this conclusion, and there are a few different ways you could go about this, but really fundamentally the way we will determine whether this reasoning is valid or not is we try to construct what we call a countervaluation. We try to construct a valuation where the premises come out true and the conclusion comes out false. So that's our goal. If we can do that, if we can construct a valuation like that, then we know that this reasoning is not valid. If we can't do that, then we know that this reasoning is valid. Let's aim for making this conclusion false first. The conclusion says there is a z such that not gz. So the conclusion is saying there is something that fails to be g. For that to be false, nothing can fail to be g. In other words, everything has to be g. So to make a valuation where the conclusion is false, we need to have a domain that's got at least one thing in it. Let's say we put the number 1 into our domain, and now the extension of the predicate g, everything that's in the domain has to be in the extension of g, because nothing can fail to be g if we're going to make the conclusion false. So we have to put the number 1, which is in our domain, into the extension of g. I'm leaving the domain open and leaving the extension of g open for now, because as I go on constructing my evaluation, trying to make this true and this true, I might want to add more things in the domain and fill these out accordingly. So now that, for now at least, we have this being false, now let's try to make this premise true. Everything that's g fails to be f. So here, 1 is in the extension of g, so it can't be in the extension of f. So when we provide an extension for f, we need to make sure that 1 is not in there. And now to make this true, though, we have to put something in the extension of f. It can't be 1. Could we put, say, 2 in here? Could we add 2 to the domain and put 2 in the extension of f? That would make there is an fx true. But wait, we still have to remember to make this false and this true to make this conclusion false. It says, again, there's something that isn't g. So to make this false, everything in the domain has to be g. Nothing can fail to be g. So that forces us to put 2 in here. And then this says everything that's g must fail to be f. Oh, wait. That means we'd have to take 2 out of the extension of f. And now this is no longer true. So it seems like every time we try to make these true and this false, we run into a problem. We can't do that because once we make this conclusion false and the second premise true, we end up having to make the extension of f empty, and there is an fx can't be true. So it looks like there is no way to construct a countervaluation for this reasoning, meaning that it must be valid. So if we really want to confirm that this reasoning is valid, we could try to construct a proof, a derivation from the premises to the conclusion within our proof system. So we start with our premises here, and this is the conclusion that we want to derive. We've got an existential statement as a premise. It makes sense to start by supposing, take some arbitrary member of the domain entirely new to the proof, not mentioned yet, and suppose that they satisfy this existential statement. And now, supposing that this arbitrary member of the domain satisfies this existential statement, we'll try to derive there is a z such that not gz. And then because this person was entirely new to the proof, if we can derive this, we'll be able to say, well, we could derive this no matter who satisfied this existential statement. And since we know somebody has to satisfy it, this conclusion can just be drawn outright. So now we're trying to derive this in this subproof here. It looks promising to use universal elimination on our second premise here. So now we have if GA then not FA. We're going to be able to derive not GA here because if we assume GA, we're going to get a contradiction. We're going to get not FA, and we already have FA. So if we assume GA, we're going to get a contradiction, which is going to get us not GA, which can get us this. So now we got not GA using reductio reasoning, and now existential introduction gets us there is a z such that not gz. And for the last step, we just appeal to existential elimination, the existential being line 1, and then the subproof 3 to 9, showing that no matter who meets this existential condition, no matter who satisfies it, we would always get there is a z, not gz. So we can just draw that conclusion outright. So trying to construct a countervaluation, we couldn't do one that suggested that this argument is valid, and we fully confirmed that by constructing a derivation from the premises to the conclusion. Okay, here's the next problem. Let's try to figure out whether this reasoning is valid. And again, we'll do that by trying to construct a countervaluation. We'll try to construct a valuation where both of these premises are true, but this conclusion is false. Let's start by trying to make our conclusion false. Our conclusion is the denial of the claim that there is an x such that sx and px. So we want to make there is an x such that sx and px true, which will make the negation of that false. So we need to have something in our domain. Let's again just put the number 1 in there that is in the extension S and in the extension of P. So far we've got this conclusion coming out false. Now let's try to make this second premise here true. That means we have to make the existential here, there is an x, sx, and not mx. We have to make that false. So we have to make sure that there's nothing that is s and fails to be m. So we have to make sure that everything that is s is m. So here we have 1 in the extension of s. We did that. We put 1 in the extension of s and p so that we could make something both s and p to make the conclusion false. So now to make this premise true, we have to put anything that's in the extension of s, we have to put that in the extension of m. So m has to have 1 in it, the extension of m. And now we've made this true so far. But what about the first premise? To make it true, we have to make there is an x such that px and mx false. So we can't have anything that's both p and m. But here we have something that is both p and m. So that makes there is an x, px, and mx true, which makes the negation of it false. It looks like once we make the conclusion false and the second premise true, we can't then make the first premise true too. That automatically forces the first premise to be false. So it doesn't look like we're going to be able to construct a countervaluation here. We can't make both premises true and this conclusion false. So it looks like this reasoning is valid. If we really want to confirm that, then we can construct a proof. So here I have my premises, and at the bottom I have the conclusion. And now I'm going to try to derive this conclusion from these premises. The conclusion that we're going for here is the negation of a formula, the negation of this existential statement. There is an x, sx, and px. So it makes sense to suppose that to be true. There is an x, sx, and px, and go for absurdity in that subproof. Okay, now to get absurdity, we've got this existential formula here. So we're going to want to use that. So it probably makes sense. The strategy that occurs to me to try at first, at least here, is to assume some arbitrary member of the domain satisfies this existential statement, someone entirely new to the proof. We haven't mentioned anyone specifically yet, so we could just pick A, Alex, as it were, to satisfy this existential. And likely we're going to derive, the way the proof is going to work is we're going to derive absurdity under this subproof, which means no matter who satisfied this existential, because this was just an entirely new individual to the proof, we would be able to derive absurdity no matter who it was that we supposed satisfied this existential. So we're going to get absurdity in here, but then we're going to be able to bring it back out here using existential elimination, and that will get us the negation of this by reductio. So we're going to be going for absurdity in here. How can we do that? Well, if we suppose MA, we're going to be able to get PA and MA. And from that, we can get there is an X, PX, and MX, which contradicts this first premise here. So now by reductio, we can get not MA. And now we can get SA and not MA, which can get us there is an X such that SX and not MX, which contradicts this first premise, which gets us the absurdity we were looking for. Now from lines 3 and the subproof from 4 to 14, we can use existential elimination to put absurdity here. And having supposed there is an X, SX, and PX and derived absurdity, we can use reductio to put the negation of there is an X, SX, and PX at this line. Okay, here's the next problem. Let's try to construct a valuation where the premises are true, but the conclusion is false. This time, let's start by making this second premise here true. So we have to put something in the domain that is S, but that fails to be M. So here we have 1 in the domain, and we put that in the extension of S, but we've left it out of the extension of M. So we've made this second premise true. Now let's try to make this conclusion false. One way for this conclusion to be false would be if nothing at all was in the extension of S, because then there couldn't be something that was S but not P. But in order to make the second premise true, we had to put something in the extension of S. So now to make this false, this says, well, there's something that's S and not P. So to make it false, we have to make sure that there isn't anything like that. So everything that is S can't fail to be P if we want this to come out false. So everything that's S, we have to make sure does satisfy the predicate P. And that will make this false. So here we have number 1 satisfying the predicate S. So in order to make this conclusion false, we've got to make sure that satisfies the predicate P. Now we've got this true, this false. Let's try to make the first premise true. This says everything that's P is M. So here we have the number 1 being P. So to make the first premise true, that would have to be M. But now if we put 1 in the extension of M, we no longer have this second premise being true anymore. We no longer have something that's S that fails to be M. So it doesn't look like we're going to be able to make both premises true and the conclusion false. It seems like once we make this true and this false, we can't make this true, because if we do, that just makes this false again. Now, if we really want to confirm that this reasoning is valid, we can try to construct a proof from the premises to the conclusion. So here we have our premises and the conclusion that we ultimately want to derive. We have an existential statement as our second premise. The best strategy here seems like it's going to be to just pick some arbitrary individual to suppose satisfies this existential. And now, having picked some arbitrary individual, say Alex, and having supposed that they satisfy this existential statement, we're going to try to show that that would lead to the conclusion there is an SX and not PX. And once we do that, we'll be able to use existential elimination to get there is an SX and not PX out here. Now, we already have SA if we're supposing that Alex satisfies this existential statement. We already have that Alex satisfies S, so we can already derive SA. And so if we can also get not PA, then we can get this. Okay, so can we get not PA? Well, if we assume PA and get absurdity, that's a way to get not PA. And so can we get absurdity here? Well, let's use our first premise. It says for all x, if px, then mx. So we know that if PA, then MA. From these two, we can clearly derive MA by modus ponens, and we have not MA here, so that will get us absurdity. So we can get not PA. We can conjoin SA and not PA to get their conjunction, SA and not PA. That'll get us there is an X, SX, and not PX, and so we'll be done with the proof. Okay, so here I've derived SA and not PA. Existential introduction gets me the next line, and existential elimination from lines 2 and the subproof from 3 to 12 gets me the final conclusion. Okay, here's the next problem. Again, trying to construct a valuation where the premises are true, but the conclusion is not. This time, let's start with the second premise, trying to make that true. So we need to make LNM false. So let's say we have a domain. Let's put Magnolia and Naveen in our domain. And let's make N refer to Naveen and M refer to Magnolia. And then to make L and M false, we need to make sure that the pair Naveen-Magnolia is not in the extension of L. So we don't want to put Naveen-Magnolia in here, and that will make L and M false, which will make the negation of it true. So far we've got the second premise being true. Now let's look at the conclusion. We want to make the conclusion false. The conclusion is the negation of this existential. So we want to make this existential statement true. So we want to make somebody love Naveen. So we can't make this extension of L entirely empty, we need to make somebody love Naveen. We've got our domain, it's got two individuals in it, Magnolia and Naveen. So we can either make Naveen love Naveen, or we can make Magnolia love Naveen. Let's try the second option first. Okay, so now we have somebody loving Naveen, so there is an X, LXN will be true, so the negation of it will be false. So we've got this true, this false. Now we just have to make this premise true. Now to make this true, we need to make the instance LAM or not LAN true when A refers to Magnolia and true when A refers to Naveen. So let's first try to make this true when A refers to Magnolia. Now if A refers to Magnolia, then LAN says Magnolia loves Naveen, and that is true on the valuation we've constructed so far. So the negation of LAN is going to be false. So if we're going to make this whole disjunction true when A refers to Magnolia, we need to make LAM true, which means we need to make Magnolia love Magnolia. So let's do that. Let's expand the extension of L here to include the pair Magnolia, Magnolia. Okay, so now this disjunction is true when A refers to Magnolia. What about when it refers to Naveen? Is the first disjunct true? Does Naveen love Magnolia? No. Now, what about the second disjunct? Is it true that Naveen loves Naveen? No, that isn't true. That's false. So the negation of it is true. So this whole disjunction is true when A refers to Naveen. So it's true in both cases, which means this universally quantified statement is true on this valuation. So in this case, we have created a valuation where the first premise is true. Everyone meets this disjunction condition. The second premise is true. Naveen does fail to love Magnolia. And the conclusion is false because there is someone that loves Naveen, namely Magnolia loves Naveen. So this reasoning is not valid, and here's a valuation that proves it. Okay, so here's the last problem. Is this reasoning valid? I could approach this one in the same way as we've approached the other ones, just try to construct a valuation where these premises are all true and this conclusion is false. But I might not have to do that in this case. That might not really be necessary, because if I look at this premise, LMN, that tells me straight away that there's someone that loves N. So this is going to be satisfied. So from these two premises, I'm going to be able to derive LON. And once I have LON, then I know that there's someone that O loves. And so therefore, with this first premise in play, I'm going to be able to derive HO, which is my conclusion. So it's pretty obvious if I just look at my premises and my conclusion that I'm going to be able to derive this conclusion from these premises, and therefore this is valid reasoning.